Hey everyone. In this video, we're going to start talking about those 6 categories of lipids that we mentioned in the first video. And so this one is all about waxes. We're going to talk about what a wax is. We'll talk about some physical properties of waxes, and then we'll talk about the hydrolysis of waxes. And by the end of the video, you should be able to understand and describe the structure of a wax and predict the products of the hydrolysis of a wax. So let's take a look at waxes. Waxes are an ester. All right, we've got an ester functional group. And on either side of the ester are long carbon tails. Each side has between 14 to 30 carbons. So between 14 and 30, so pretty long. They're produced by plants, animals, insects. They're usually used as a protective coating against water or other environmental factors. Beeswax is kind of unique because they use it to build structures in the honeycomb, but most animals use it as like a waterproof coating. So like feathers on water birds like ducks, they can dive underwater and come up and just shake their feathers and they're not all soggy because they're coated in a wax. Same thing with leaves, right? When it rains, the rainwater just drips off the leaf. It protects the leaves from rotting, but it also protects them from getting eaten by insects, and it protects them from losing water when it gets hot out because it like traps the moisture in. So it's usually a molecular level protective coating produced by organisms. So let's talk about how we make this wax. Waxes are made from a fatty acid and an alcohol. And this is just your typical esterification reaction that we talked about in chapter 12. So it's an esterification. We are going to kick out the OH and the H to make water. And where we kick that out, we connect them here as an ester bond. So the wax is your ester. The only thing that makes it a wax is the fact that these carbon tails are really, really long. We use R, means like the rest of the molecule. So it's just an abbreviation for like the rest of the molecule, R. Okay. So these are going to be long carbon tails on both sides. Now, the opposite of esterification is hydrolysis. And so we're going to be adding the water back in, and we're going to be cutting the wax in half. So hydro for water, lysis to cut it open. And so when you cut it open, you go back to the fatty acid and the alcohol. And this can be done with an acid catalyst. It can also be done using enzymes in your body if you eat it as a food. Now let's take a look at some examples of waxes. Beeswax has 14 carbons on the carboxylic acid side and 30 carbons on the alcohol side. And beeswax, once again, is what bees use to make the honeycomb structure. Another common wax is carnauba wax. This comes from the Brazilian palm tree. It's got 26 carbons on the fatty acid side and 30 carbons on the alcohol side. We typically use this for furniture. It's like we melt the wax and then we rub it into the wood. So like wood finishing with that like nice waterproof coating that makes the wood look nice and dark and pretty. It's carnauba wax like rubbed into the wood. We also use jojoba wax. Jojoba wax is 20 carbons on both sides, actually. This comes from the jojoba bush. We use it to make soaps. It's in cosmetics, a lot of like moisture creams. You can actually have candles made out of it. Just some common examples of waxes. You don't need to know the specifics. I'm just showing you examples where you might see waxes in your everyday life. One that I'd like to go on a tangent about, though, is spermaceti wax. So spermaceti wax comes from this magnificent creature here, the sperm whale. And they have a really large bulbous head. And if you look at a cross section of their head, they have what's called the spermaceti organ in their head. And it's basically just this giant sac filled with spermaceti wax. And they use the spermaceti wax. There's two theories on what they use it for, and both have strong evidence. The first is that they use it for echolocation. And so the wax can be a liquid in there, but it's more dense than the water. Excuse me, it's less dense than the water, sorry. And so when sound waves move through the water and then get to the whale's head, they move more quickly through the spermaceti wax. And depending on the difference between when the sound wave hits its ear versus like moves through its head, they can detect which direction the sound waves are coming from. And so they can use it as like an echolocation underwater. So the whales make those clicking sounds. And then when the clicks come back, the spermaceti wax helps them interpret the 3D location that the sound waves are coming from. And so that's how they can navigate in the ocean in total darkness. The other theory is that it's for their buoyancy. So sperm whales can float essentially underwater without swimming. And so this picture, the whale's actually sleeping underwater, perfectly upright. They actually sleep like this. It's pretty crazy. If you go to Thailand, you can scuba dive with them while they're sleeping. This is a picture from somebody on vacation in Thailand, which is like pretty cool. But so we talked about waxes and fatty acids having melting temperatures around room temperature. The whale can control the blood flow around this organ. And so if they pump more warm blood to it, they can melt the wax, which changes its density and makes it float. And so by pumping their blood through their head, they can melt the wax and it will make them float up without having to swim. Or they can stop the blood flow and the wax will get cold from the surrounding water and it will solidify. And when it solidifies, it gets more dense and it will make the whale sink. And so they can control whether they go up or down underwater without swimming just by the blood flow to that wax region in their head, which is really cool. Now, what's really sad is hundreds of years ago, this wax was considered really useful for making candles and oil lamps, also for perfumes and cosmetics. And these whales were hunted almost to extinction just for the wax that they produced in their head. So one adult sperm whale could produce something like 500 gallons of spermaceti wax. And so here's a real image from the late 1800s. They would harpoon the whales, then they would go down in little boats and they would cut the head off the whale and they would hoist it up onto the ship. They would throw away the whole whale's body. They didn't want the meat. They would just cut off the head. And then once on deck, they would cut open the head and they would drain all the wax out into wooden barrels. And they would stay out at the ocean for months, just killing as many as they could. And then when the ship was totally full, they'd come back to dock. And here's a photo of the dock with several whaling ships. And all these barrels are full of spermaceti wax. And you can imagine how many dead whales this represents. And this was just, your average Tuesday at the whaling docks. And this went on for well over 100, 200 years. And we almost killed all the sperm whales off because we just wanted wax to make candles out of, which is pretty wild. So if you've never heard, why whales are endangered, one of the reasons was we were hunting them just for wax. Even though you can get the same wax or a similar wax out of plants. Just a crazy example of humans exploiting the environment. And here's a real image of Whitehall sperm candles from spermaceti wax. Yep. So this right here is why we killed all the whales. Pretty crazy. You don't need to know any of that story. I just thought you might find it interesting since we were busy talking about waxes. So once again, to recap, waxes are esters with long carbon tails on both sides. You make them from a fatty acid and an alcohol doing an esterification, and you can hydrolyze them using acid and water to go back to the fatty acid and the alcohol. So thanks for watching. See you in the next video.